All right, let's dive into something that literally runs the world behind the scenes. Treaties. We're going to pull back the curtain on how these massive global rulebooks actually get made.
You hear about these big-name agreements all the time, right? The Paris Agreement on climate change, the Geneva Conventions on war. But have you ever stopped to think, how on earth do you get nearly 200 different countries, with all their own interests and politics, to agree on anything, let alone a single binding rulebook? It seems impossible.
Okay, so before we get into how the deals get made, we have to start with the basics. First things first, what even is a treaty?
Well, the official definition is actually pretty straightforward. This comes from what's basically the Treaty on Treaties, the Vienna Convention, and it boils down to three key things. It has to be between states, it has to be in writing, and it has to be governed by international law. That's it. It's the formal, written handshake that shapes everything from global trade to human rights.
And the whole system is built on this one super important idea. It's a Latin phrase, pacta sunt servanda, which just means agreements must be kept. It's the simple but powerful promise that when a country signs on the dotted line, it's going to act in good faith and follow through. Without this, none of it works.
Now, don't let the names trip you up. You'll hear things called a convention, or a protocol, or a charter, or a covenant. At the end of the day, they're all just different words for the same thing, a treaty. The label doesn't change the fact that it's a legally binding agreement.
So, now we know what we're dealing with. But how does an idea actually become international law? Well, it's a journey with some very specific steps.
Think of it like a three-stage process. First, you have adoption. This is where all the negotiators haggle over the text and finally agree, okay, this is the document. Then comes the signature. A country's representative signs it, which is a big political signal. It means we like this and we promise not to actively work against it. But the real final step, the one that truly counts, is ratification. That's when a country goes home, gets its own internal approval like from its parliament, and then formally declares to the world, we are officially in, we consent to be bound.
And this is a super important distinction because it trips a lot of people up. Signing a treaty is like getting engaged. You're showing serious intent, but you're not married yet. Ratification? That's the wedding. That is the moment it becomes legally binding for that country. It's the I do of international law.
Okay, now we get to my favorite part, because this is where the clean, simple theory meets messy global reality. Getting 193 countries to agree on every single word is, well, it's basically impossible. So international law has this really clever, if a little complicated, workaround.
Think about it. What if there's a huge treaty with hundreds of articles, and a country is on board with almost all of it, except for one little provision that clashes with its own laws? Do they have to walk away from the whole thing? The system says, not necessarily.
And the answer is something called a reservation. It's basically a country saying, okay, we agree to this whole treaty except for this one part. It's like you're moving into a new house with a bunch of roommates, and you agree to all the house rules, but you file a little note saying, just so you know, I won't be doing dishes on Tuesdays. It's this little bit of flexibility that makes these big global agreements possible.
And the whole point of this is just practical. The goal of international law is to get as many countries as possible to participate. So allowing states to opt out of minor parts they disagree with makes them much more likely to join the treaty overall. It's about maximizing participation, even if it means the rules aren't perfectly uniform for everyone.
But of course, that flexibility comes at a price. And that price is complexity. Because when one country makes a reservation, it sets off this ripple effect, and every other country in the treaty has to decide how to react to it.
So let's say State A makes a reservation. Now State B has a choice. It can accept it, and if it does, the treaty exists between them with that little change. Or State B can object. If it objects, then the part of the treaty that the reservation is about just doesn't apply between those two countries at all. You can imagine how this creates a crazy spiderweb of different legal obligations between all the different parties.
Of course, there have to be limits, right? You can't just opt out of the whole point of the treaty. A reservation isn't allowed if it goes against the object and purpose of the agreement. You can't, for example, join a treaty that bans nuclear weapons and then make a reservation saying you'd still like to keep yours. It just defeats the entire purpose.
And this is where things get really heated and really important, especially when we start talking about human rights treaties.
So this is the big debate. Can a country sign a treaty banning torture, but make a reservation allowing it in, say, national security cases? A lot of people argue that no, that totally guts the treaty. And so there's this really fascinating new trend called severability.
The idea is that if a country makes an invalid reservation like that, the reservation is just ignored. It's severed, it's cut off, and the country is now bound by the entire treaty anyway. It's a pretty bold move to make sure human rights law isn't watered down. So after all the negotiation, the signing, the ratifying, the reservations, and the objections, there is one final switch that needs to be flipped to bring the whole thing to life.
It's called entry into force. This is the official start date. It's the moment the treaty wakes up and becomes legally binding on all the countries that have ratified it. And every treaty gets to decide for itself when that moment is.
And usually it's triggered when a certain number of countries have ratified it. So for the Vienna Convention itself, the treaty that sets out all these rules, it said it would only enter into force once 35 countries had fully ratified it, which finally happened back in 1980.
And all this brings us back to a really big question. This whole system is a brilliant balancing act, right? It's trying to create universal rules while respecting that every country is independent. But with tools like reservations, where countries can basically pick and choose which parts of the rulebook apply to them, it makes you wonder how unified and ultimately how powerful is international law, really. It's something to think about.